There's 62 million millionaires in the world today, but only 12.3 million people own about 0.01 Bitcoin or more. And in about 5 years, majority of millionaires are not going to be able to afford this much Bitcoin. In today's video, I'm going to break down the math that's going to explain exactly why that's the case and much more. But first, let's start off with the numbers and dive into the data. As I stated in the intro, there's only about 12.4 million Bitcoin wallets holding at least 0.01 Bitcoin. So you can join a club of 50 million people smaller for just $1,200. But here's what's changing. That gap is widening, and the data shows that it is accelerating. Because currently, if you look at not only the amount of wallets that are holding 0.01 Bitcoin, we're also looking at the Bitcoin on exchanges chart. Now, there's some interesting facts about this chart that I want to draw your attention to. Obviously, we see massive amounts of Bitcoin taking off exchanges, especially starting in November of 2024. That's coincidentally when Donald Trump was elected into office. So currently, there's about 2.13 million Bitcoin left on exchanges. That's a 6-year low, the lowest since November 2018. And in January 2024, there was about 3 million Bitcoin on exchanges. So there's been a decline since 2024 of 668,000 Bitcoin removed from exchanges. And since Trump was elected in November of 24, we've seen 171,000 Bitcoin moved off exchanges. We've seen roughly about 30,000 Bitcoin taken off exchanges, and that monthly outflow every single month has been about 85,000 Bitcoin taken off exchanges. So there's only about 2.14 million Bitcoin letting on exchanges right now. That's an entire liquid supply available to buy at market prices. Now, in January, we were at 3 million. So 700,000 has simply been wiped and vanished from the market in less than a year. And since that November election, 171,000 more Bitcoin have been left off exchanges. And on top of it, what we're also seeing is the potential of this quote unquote bank run of these exchanges. Now, if you look at all of this, right, there's about 2.152 million Bitcoin on exchanges from the beginning of this year. Right now, there's about 2.14. So 380,000 have been taken off. And at the current Bitcoin price at the time of this video is about 107,000. So this is about $42.79 billion worth of Bitcoin taken off exchanges today. But you got to ask yourself, all right, how are we going to put this into context? Is this similar to anything that we've seen previously? Because obviously we've seen a lot of bank runs, we've seen bank failures. Coinbase, Circle, these companies are filing to become banking charters. So if we were to see a quote unquote run on the bank like we saw earlier this year, how much is this comparison of Bitcoin taken off exchanges in comparison to what we saw earlier last year? Well, to put some numbers on it and just really break it down in that sense, there was about $42 billion withdrawn in a single day. So granted, we are not close to that bank run that we saw from Silicon Valley Bank in 2023, and Signature Bank saw about 10 billion worth of deposit withdrawn in the same week, and First Republic Bank saw $100 billion, but that was in the entire quarter. So they saw a gradual decline where Silicon Valley Bank saw a huge amount in a single day. But we are seeing something that is very interesting with the Bitcoin space, and that's not only are we seeing exchanges have this potential of the supply shock, but we're also seeing massive amounts of ETF inflows. Now, when the Bitcoin ETFs got passed in January of 2024, this essentially changed everything. But here's where it gets insane. When you really take a step in and look at the Bitcoin ETF inflows and dive into the numbers, you will be shocked at the amount of inflows that you see, because the Bitcoin ETFs in November alone saw 6.46 billion in inflows. BlackRock's IBIT ETF accounted for 5.6 billion of that itself. That's 80% of all those inflows. And on November 7th, the day of the election, the ETFs recorded the largest single day of inflows ever at 1.38 billion. That's equivalent to buying roughly 3 days worth of newly mined Bitcoin in a single day. And that is just from the ETFs. BlackRock's IBIT ETF is now becoming the fastest ETF to see 1 billion in assets under management. It got there in 435 days. The previous record took 2011 days. Think about that. BlackRock is absorbing Bitcoin faster than any ETF in history has absorbed any asset. And you put that onto the digital scarcity that Bitcoin has, and you're primed for an explosion. And here's the critical part. ETF buyers can't withdraw actual Bitcoin. When you buy the IBIT ETF, you're permanently removing that Bitcoin from the liquid supply because it goes into that institutional custody and it's not coming back to exchanges. Together, all Bitcoin ETFs now hold over 1 million Bitcoin. That's a Satoshi. That's nearly half of all the Bitcoin sitting on exchanges, and they are not selling. Now, on top of it, we've seen some very interesting activity from the Bitcoin miners because previously Bitcoin miners needed to sell in order to cover costs. But during this bull run, we've seen something very interesting. They're now starting to increase their holdings and actually continue to hold Bitcoin. And they're becoming some of the biggest Bitcoin holders when it comes to their treasury companies because, of course, strategy makes the headlines, and we'll get into them in a bit. So if you take a look at the top 100 publicly traded Bitcoin treasury companies, we've got Marathon Holdings at number 2 with 53,000 Bitcoin. Then we've got Riot Platforms at 19,000 at number 7. And then we've got CleanSpark at number 10 with over 13,000 Bitcoin. So out of these top 10, we have 3 Bitcoin mining companies in the top 100. But why is this significant? Because Bitcoin miners are the people who create new Bitcoin. So something has changed. Miners are now sitting from about 1.8 to 1.9 million Bitcoin, and they're not selling, even at $100,000. So miner outflows to exchanges are at their lowest level since April. The top US mining companies alone hold 73,000 Bitcoin. And these companies have explicitly stated they're holding for the long term. They're treating Bitcoin like a treasury asset, not an inventory to dump. So when the people creating new supply refuse to sell and only 450 Bitcoin are created per day, it's now causing a structural supply problem, not a temporary one, a permanent one. And here's where something becomes inevitable. As I alluded to just moments ago, we've got one of the biggest Bitcoin holders in strategy now buying with a vengeance. They have literally bought every single week except for 2 since Donald Trump has been elected. Now, that's almost a full year's worth of buying, nearly 52 weeks in a row of buying. And they aren't slowing down. They just bought 397 Bitcoin earlier this week at the time of this recording. But we're also seeing how much Bitcoin holdings that they are increasing. They're now over 640,000 Bitcoin, and they are not slowing down anytime soon because MicroStrategy stock keeps going up. It's up 370% in a year by holding Bitcoin. Their competitors are going to start to buy more Bitcoin. And we're seeing that game theory really play out when you look at the Bitcoin 100 or the top 100 publicly traded Bitcoin treasury companies, because this is where we're starting to see more companies come on. And if BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF becomes their most profitable product ever in under a year, what is Fidelity doing? Vanguard. If El Salvador's Bitcoin holdings are starting to appreciate 500%, what are the other countries looking at? This is a prisoner's dilemma. The first movers get the supply at lower prices, and the laggards pay exponentially more or get nothing at all. So when Marathon sees their Bitcoin holdings now worth billions, and every other mining company has to ask, why are we selling? When one corporate board approves Bitcoin as a treasury asset, and every other board has to justify why they're not doing it. This isn't just speculation. This is how the game theory is starting to play out with a finite supply of assets. And we're watching this happen in real time. So, what is the math with all this? Why is 0.01 Bitcoin now going to be seemingly unaffordable for the millionaires in the world? Make sure you guys are hitting that subscribe button and that like button if you're enjoying this video so far, as I am diving into this math here very soon, because this supply shock is something that I've been telling you guys for quite some time, because these treasury companies, although they are buying, they're not logging into a Coinbase account by any means and buying Bitcoin. They're doing it at OTC desk or over the counter. And so these 2.13, 2.14 million Bitcoin left on exchanges, well, that's for us, the plebs, the people looking at this and buying. And once those start to come off and we see OTC desks running lower and lower, well, these top 100 companies are going to be looking for other places to buy Bitcoin. And if you aren't selling, well, that means that we're going to see some craziness, to say the least. And we see 85,000 Bitcoin taken off per month currently. So with the 2.14 to 2.15, that leaves about 27 months until exchanges hit zero, which would mean this would be at about early 2027. But if this ETF buying, which has been accelerating, and you can tell from this ETF daily inflows chart where you're starting to see much more green here than red over this past year, to say the very least, well, this can accelerate. November ETF inflows, we saw 6.46 billion, or about 64,600 Bitcoin absorbed. So if this pace continues, we'll see 12 to 18 months until this supply shock occurs. So the realistic timeline with all of this, 12 to 18 months before we hit a liquidity crisis. Not a supply shock, a liquidity crisis, when you literally cannot buy Bitcoin at market prices because there isn't any for sale. So remember the key drivers in all of this. We're seeing MicroStrategy now increase their Bitcoin holdings to over 660,000 Bitcoin. We're seeing ETF daily inflows reach all-time highs, and we're seeing those OTC desks be drained very quickly. Now let's talk about governments. On July 31st, 2024, Senator Cynthia Lummis introduced the Bitcoin Act, the coveted Bitcoin strategic reserve, where the United States would buy 1 million Bitcoin over a 5-year period and hold it for 20 years. The bill was initially blocked by Democrats. Then President Donald Trump won the election, and he's become one of the most pro-Bitcoin presidents that we've ever seen. So now Senator Cynthia Lummis was appointed the chair of the subcommittee of digital assets. So she introduced the bill, and she had 5 co-signers, and then Donald Trump immediately signed an executive order to put into a Bitcoin strategic reserve. But there's one caveat with all of this. They've said that they don't want to cost the taxpayer any money in order to supply this Bitcoin strategic reserve. So how are they going to buy? So it leaves the question, when will the United States print the global reserve currency in order to buy Bitcoin, which is intended to replace it? It's not just game theory, it's inevitable. So every Bitcoin cycle has been very similar. Bitcoin skyrockets and then crashes 70 to 80%, and then it all repeats. But this time, this cycle is different. And I know why everybody always says that, but as the factors I'm lining out, and if you take a look at the price action that we've seen here recently, it explains all why. In 2017, retail FOMO drove it to 20K, and then everybody sold down 85%. In 2021, we saw some institutions buy, price hit 69K, and then institutions sold. Therefore, the price dropped 75%. But in 2024 and 2025, it's structurally different. The ETFs have absorbed 1 million Bitcoin, and they cannot sell. They're passive vehicles. MicroStrategy has accumulated 660,000 Bitcoin, and they won't ever sell. It's stated in their strategy. Miners are holding instead of dumping, and governments are now preparing to buy. Previous cycles, demand spikes, then you see a supply dump and a crash. This cycle, demand spikes and there's been no supply dump. Sure, some of the coveted whales that have been around for a while have been selling off, but it's being scooped up at a very quick rate. And if you look at the overall price action, it is something that is very interesting. We're having the first October where we had a green September and now a red October. We reached the all time high prior to the halving. And with all of this, people are very bearish as the Bitcoin price has been lulling and crab walking sideways. The counter arguments are essentially all destroyed, saying that the governments will ban it. Well, 124 publicly traded companies are now holding Bitcoin. SEC has approved Bitcoin ETFs. There's a senator proposing for a Bitcoin strategic reserve. And there's essentially a mainstream influence and infrastructure of Bitcoin. Now, if you take a look at the other cryptos and you say, oh, other cryptos will replace Bitcoin. Bitcoin's too old. Well, the network effects of 15 years and all the corporations that are buying Bitcoin and not these altcoins would say otherwise. There's been 170 billion in ETF inflows in Bitcoin and Bitcoin only, not these other cryptos. So if you really take a step back and look, well, it seems like the institutions are realizing it's Bitcoin and Bitcoin only. Now, all these people that are saying that they will buy the dip, this is where it gets interesting. In 2022, Bitcoin dropped to 16K, and how many bought? Now corporations own the dip supply. And so when Bitcoin drops, we're seeing just a 10 to 15% drop opposed to the 70, 80% drops that we saw previously. And that next dip gets bought up by the ETFs extremely quickly. Now, the argument that Bitcoin's in a bubble, well, we're in a $2.5 trillion market cap asset now. And that's something that I don't think we will see here going forward because it requires leverage. Current leverage ratios are lower than that in 2021. The corporate treasury allocations are extremely high, and institutions don't create bubbles. They provide price floors because they are not going into the market quickly to pump and dump. Now, you might be saying retail hasn't come in, so where are they? They might be saying, I missed it. But when you see 100K go to $1 million, that 10x is the same as 10K to 100K. And those returns might be compressed, but absolute dollar gains do increase. And we're seeing everybody flock away from the dollar into more stable assets like Bitcoin, like gold, and the stock market. So even though the overall economy might be a little shaky, we are seeing everybody go into assets and invest their money, get out of just holding the dollar. So with that 0.01 Bitcoin now at 100K, 107K at the time of this recording, that's about $1,100. And then when we see $1 million Bitcoin, that's when 0.01 Bitcoin becomes $10,000. That's a $9,000 gain. So show me another asset where that is even realistic, because 12 and a half years ago, if you bought $1,000 worth of Bitcoin, well, you'd be a millionaire here today. So here's what to watch if you want to see this thesis play out. First is the exchange reserves. As we see this chart closer to 1 million Bitcoin left on exchanges, that liquidity crisis is going to be imminent. Number two is the ETF inflows. Once we start to see November type of numbers with 6.46 billion in one day, if that accelerates to over 1 billion per day consistently, that supply shock can arrive early. The third is congressional progress. Once we see that Bitcoin Act start to go into law and this start to accelerate, well, let's just say the game theory will start to play out. These metrics will tell you in real time whether you're right or wrong. So why am I doing this video on 0.01 Bitcoin and not one full coin? Well, it's simple, the math. There's 21 million Bitcoin and there's 0.01 Bitcoin is about 1/21 millionth of the total supply. So only 2.1 billion people could ever own 0.10 Bitcoin or more, and currently only 12.3 million people do. That's only 0.58% of the global population. So at different price points, that 0.01 Bitcoin is now at 100K, about $1,000, at 500K, $5,000, a million, $10,000, and at 10 million, $100,000. So that 0.01 Bitcoin at $1,200, that's obtainable. And it puts you in a group of 12.3 million people out of 8 billion. You're in the top 0.15% globally. So when Bitcoin hits 1 million, and multiple analysts say it will, that 0.01 Bitcoin becomes $10,000. And when it hits 10 million, like Jeff Booth's model suggests, that will be $100,000. So the new standard isn't whole coin or status, it's 0.01 Bitcoin. And at $1,200, you can still reach it. So now for some price catalysts and a timeline for all of this as to when I think these price targets are going to actually hit. So in Q4 of 2024, we're going to see ETF inflow momentum continuing. We're going to see post-halving supply fully absorbed. And that target price for me is going to be about 150K to 175K by the end of this year. Then in Q2 and in Q3 of 2025, this is where we can get a little interesting, where we see the potential of the Bitcoin Act actually passing. You can see corporate FOMO start to accelerate. And if that strategic reserve is approved, you'll see an immediate spike to 200K very quickly. And without it, I think that we'll still get to 175 to 225,000 very quickly. Now, in 2026, I think that this bull run gets extended because we're going to start to see an exchange supply liquidity crisis. And that liquidity crisis is going to start pushing that target to 300K to 500K. Now, I think that this bull run is going to extend into 2026, and let me explain why. Well, we've got a liquidity crisis looming with just 1 million Bitcoin, say, left on exchanges during this time. And then we have new products coming online where you don't need to sell your Bitcoin, Salt being one of them. Now, Salt is giving an exclusive offer to the Green Candle listeners. So if you guys go over to saltlending.com/green-candle or the link down below, they're going to give you guys an exclusive offer. They've got some of the best rates in the industry starting at 8.95% with a 12-month duration, and you could borrow up to a 70% LTV. But the best part of all of this is they've got the Salt Shield. They're no liquidation solution, so you can borrow against your Bitcoin and unlock your purchasing power stress-free. And this is going to all add to that liquidity crisis because Jeff Booth has now come out and said on my podcast that the fair value of Bitcoin earlier this year was $43 million per coin. Now, if you see that and you do the math, he's exactly correct. And on top of it all, with Bitcoin at $43 million a coin and continuing to increase, why would you ever want to sell? So that liquidity crisis that started in 2026 is going to explode into 2027 and 2028 with a full-on supply shock, where essentially you can't buy Bitcoin on the market anymore. And everybody that has Bitcoin is going to be trying to hold it in a very secure place, such as self-custody. And this is why I trust one of the longest standing brands in the industry, and that's Trezor. You can go to the affiliate link down below in the show notes and get yourself a new Trezor Safe 7. I was one of the first people to get my hands on this, and it's the first ever quantum ready Bitcoin hardware wallet where it's fully wireless and you could set it up on Bluetooth if you liked. They've got the first audible secure element, which is absolutely insane, and it is so easy to use. So I highly recommend you guys go and get yours because this is a solution I use to store my Bitcoin. On top of it, you can go to cryptosteel.com/greencandle, use promo code greencandle today to get 10% off your seed phrase storage, and they use steel. The best part about all of this is that their backups offer a no tamper solution, where all of these other backups, they're just simply plates. So if somebody looks at your seed phrase, you're not going to be able to know. But from a crypto steel case, this is the only solution that I've seen on the market where you can know if somebody opens your seed phrase and is trying to steal it from you. So go to cryptosteel.com/greencandle today, use promo code greencandle, and you get 10% off the best solution to store your seed phrase. So zero point zero 0.01 Bitcoin cost about $1,200 today, and only 12.3 million people own that much Bitcoin or more. The data shows it. The data also shows there's 2.14 million Bitcoin left on exchanges, and that is falling fast. $6.5 billion worth of ETF inflows happened in the month of November of last year. There's over 200 publicly traded companies holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet today, and that number is increasing by the day. And government legislation is advancing and advancing quickly. So you can join the club today, or you can just watch this supply disappear. Make sure you hit that subscribe button below if you want some more deep dives on the supply crisis, and make sure to let me know in the comments what you guys think, because the numbers don't lie. The window is closing fast. I'll catch you guys at the next one.